Okay, good morning, world history people, or good afternoon, sorry. For some of you, it's good afternoon. All right, so we are going to talk about how ancient Rome went from a republic to an empire and really a dictatorship, which we sort of talked about with Julius Caesar. And then we're going to talk about the rise of Christianity, and we're going to bring it up to the fall of the empire. So the next time we get together after this, we're going to briefly talk about the fall of the Roman Empire, and then we are going to spend the rest of the time reviewing, because the following time, so next Tuesday and Wednesday, depending on A or B day, which day you're on, we're going to have the test on Greece and Rome. Make sure you're filling out the note sheet that you have. You're going to use that after this to do the questions on Kia. All right, so let's set the stage. In the map below, you can see how the Roman Empire expanded over time, starting with these, starting obviously right here on the boot on the Italian peninsula in purple. Eventually it starts expanding. They defeat Carthage in the Punic Wars, and pretty soon they've got an empire that's building all the way around the Mediterranean Sea, which helps to expand trade and also to be able to move their military around and conquer new lands. So after the Punic Wars, Rome becomes the undisputed power around the Mediterranean. And that's big. And remember, Italy, the Italian peninsula, is the midpoint of the Mediterranean. That helps with trade, so ships stop there. As with other empires, trying to defend a massive amount of land can become a challenge. Even with a huge military like Rome had, it became a challenge. And that led to some of the breakdown of the republic form of government that they had. Through the lands that they conquered, they expanded and they increased their wealth. But there was a growing divide between the upper class, the patricians, and the lower class, the plebeians. And also there was a breakdown in military ardor. Patriotism declined. They had to use mercenaries instead of volunteers in their army. And as you saw, they also developed, let me back up, coins. Now when you have a common currency like that, that can help you build and maintain an empire, because it can be a problem if all your states or provinces all have their own coins. If you get everybody on the same page with the same currency, it helps. Anytime there is a growing gap between the rich and poor, there's the danger of a revolution, of the lower class revolting. So while the rich lived on huge estates, the poor either worked on the estates or they lived in cities in really cramped apartments. Now remember with the slaves, in addition to slaves working on those estates, remember that also slaves started taking away jobs from the poor, like the small farmers who found themselves without land. They go to the estates to look for jobs, they go to the cities to look for jobs, and here they have slaves from conquered lands who take the jobs away from them. So that also adds to the conflict between the lower class and the upper class. About a third of Rome's population were slaves, so that's almost comparable, not quite, to what we saw in Greece at Sparta. So you had generals, Roman generals, who seized power for themselves. The way they would recruit soldiers is by promising them land, but that became tough over time. So how could you entice people to volunteer? That became a challenge. So what the generals turned to were mercenaries, soldiers for hire. And the problem there is that with mercenaries, their loyalty was to the generals, not to Rome itself. So they didn't have that same patriotism that volunteers did. That becomes a problem if you have a hard-fought battle. Who's more likely to fight to the death? People who volunteered and who have this pride in their nation or mercenaries whose loyalty is to the money that they're paid, basically. Julius Caesar. He, Crassus, and Pompey made up a three-way leadership of ancient Rome in 60 BC. So you had Caesar and Pompey, who were generals. You had a member of the upper class in Crassus. It can be a problem when you have rulers who have to share power among themselves. You many times have power struggles, and that's what we see here. If I go through this a little faster, remember you can pause it or back up if you miss something. So for a decade they ruled together, but Crassus died, and Pompey, who you see in the middle here, was suspicious of Julius Caesar and his popularity. He feared Caesar's popularity and that he feared that Caesar wanted to just have a one-person dictatorship. And he was right, of course. If you remember, after Caesar conquered to the north, like in Gaul, which is like France today, he was told by the Senate at Pompey's urging not to cross the Rubicon and come back to Rome. Well, Caesar ignored that line in the sand, so to speak, and marched back to Rome. Pompey fled to Egypt, where the Pharaoh, Ptolemy III, had him beheaded. And when Caesar arrived in Egypt pursuing Pompey, the Pharaoh handed the head to Caesar. The Senate made Caesar dictator for life. So this is what I just talked about, with Pompey worrying about Caesar, telling the Senate, disband the legion, the army that Caesar was commanding to the north. Caesar ignored the Senate, crossed the Rubicon, and marched into Rome. He was very popular among the masses. So there were those series of defeats of Pompey against Caesar. He fled to Egypt again, and that's where he was beheaded, and his head was handed to Caesar. And upon returning, the Senate in Rome made Julius Caesar dictator for life in 46 BC. But it's a short life that he lives, at least after that. So even though Caesar has total control, and he says that he wants to return Rome to its republic roots, he's really moving it closer to an empire where he will rule by himself. So his legacy, and this is where the question comes, was he simply just a dictator who abused his power, or was he a reformer, or was he both? He expanded the Senate, which gave more representation to more people in society. He gave citizenship to people in these provinces that were carved out from the new territories that the Romans conquered. He helped the poor out by doing public works projects, building roads and bridges, which gave jobs to the poor. He gave more pay to soldiers. So as we look at that, those would definitely be reforms. So maybe Caesar was a combination of a dictator, but also one who reformed things to try and make things better. But again, you have to keep in mind, he was most popular among the plebeians, the lower classes. So maybe he did this primarily to continue their support. So even after Pompey was dead, nobles, the upper class who controlled the land, and the senators, also made up of the upper class, were concerned about Caesar's power and how popular he was among the masses. They feared their power was declining while his was going up. Some considered him a tyrant, so a dictator who was abusing his power. So from the simulation we did, you know that Caesar was stabbed to death on the floor of the Senate by a gang of other senators led by his supposed friend Marcus Brutus and Gaius Cassius. March 15th, 44 BC. That's where the expression "beware of the Ides of March" comes from. A depiction of the murder, assassination of Caesar in 44 BC. His nephew Octavian eventually steps to the front. This was the second triumvirate, so his Julius Caesar's nephew Octavian enters into a triumvirate with Mark Antony and Lepidus. So that was, those three shared power in ancient Rome. Like his dad, he was angling for, or like his uncle, I mean, he was angling for power to himself. So he forces one piece of the triumvirate out. So Lepidus, he forces him to retire. Mark Antony goes to Egypt, falls in love with Queen Cleopatra. Now, Cleopatra had had a son with Julius Caesar. There are the coins with the second triumvirate. So Octavian is right here, and then you see Mark Antony and Lepidus. So Octavian angled to push Mark Antony out of the shared power relationship that they had over Rome, and he made an accusation against them of planning to rule Rome from Egypt, and this led to another civil war. And Octavian was able to defeat Cleopatra and Mark Antony using the Roman navy, and those two committed suicide, and that left Octavian as the sole leader of Rome. And he took on the name Augustus, meaning exalted one. And actually, the full title was Augustus Caesar. Caesar means king in Latin. And you'll see a series of rulers of Rome after this that have Caesar in their name. So, with that, Rome is officially an empire, and it's a massive empire. Not as big as the Persians or Alexander the Great, but still extremely large, all the way up here to England or Britain. So you see the peak of Roman power from 27 BC to 180 AD, so a period of over 200 years. This period is called Pax Romana, or Roman peace, the period of peace in Rome's history. They grew to a massive population because their empire was so large, so 60 to 80 million people, with 1 million people in the city of Rome. Augustus used an efficient government to run the empire. Unfortunately, after Augustus, you had a number of weak or abusive emperors, and eventually the empire collapses. Talked about common coinage before and its importance in building and maintaining an empire. It makes trade easier when there is one currency. The Romans used some of that wealth through trade and some of their knowledge of science to build an extensive network of roads. So 250,000 miles of roads. That's an incredible amount at that time. Mostly agrarian, so mostly farming, and trade was common. The roads helped to increase trade, to make it easier to move about and faster. It also helped the military move about as well. Colosseum we talked about. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. I think we understand that very well. It was for entertainment, and it was also a way for the upper class to control the lower class. When economic times were bad, the upper class figured that if they gave them a spectacle to watch, it would take their mind off their bad situation, where they might blame the upper class for why they're struggling. One of the big changes that happens during the Roman Empire is the rise of another monotheistic religion. So we had Judaism before this. Now we have Christianity, which would have really important changes on the world and on the Roman Empire. So Jesus of Nazareth, born between 6 or possibly 4 BC, started his ministry at age 30. Happened during the period called Pax Romana, the time of Roman peace. Why did that set up Jesus of Nazareth to be able to profess his ministry and evangelize? Because during Pax Romana, this was a period of peace where there was safe travel and trade. So that made it easier for him to spread his beliefs and ideas. So why did so many people eventually become Christians? First of all, it offered salvation where you could be saved and have eternal life. And that was available to everybody. And that gave meaning and purpose to life. Also, it gave people a sense of belonging when they joined. Something that the huge Roman Empire really couldn't do. And then finally, it offered salvation to anybody of any class of people. Rome, the Roman Empire, was one of really divided social classes between the haves and the have-nots. Christianity pushed that aside and said it didn't matter who you are. You could be the poorest person and you could have salvation. So that had a very special appeal to people who were in the lower class. And that was the biggest part of the population. So why was Jesus of Nazareth crucified? The Roman Empire saw him as a threat to their authority, and they saw him as a possible revolutionary. So he could lead the masses in revolt against the empire. So they very much feared him. The person who ordered the crucifixion was Pontius Pilate, who was the procurator or the Roman official. And a few other reasons that the Romans, at least initially, disliked Christians. What Jesus was preaching would lead people away from the Roman gods, which were regarded as false idols. And that would endanger salvation. So one of the 10 Commandments, warns against the worship of false idols. And several of the emperors persecuted Christians for their beliefs, like the Emperor Nero. And by pulling people away from the Roman gods, that was a crime that was punishable by death. So that's how we get the crucifixion. So why did Christianity grow? Again, it appealed to so many different classes of people because it said anybody could have salvation. It gave hope to the powerless, the people at the bottom. It appealed to people who lacked patriotism in Rome. And it was unique and different from the Roman and Greek religions because it offered anybody a personal relationship with God and life after death, salvation. This opens the way for Constantine. So Constantine was the first Roman emperor who was a Christian. He issued the Edict of Milan. So this is a declaration made by the Roman emperor, and it legalized Christianity where Romans could become Christians and not fear persecution, being singled out for mistreatment. or oppression. Theodosius the Great is the Roman who declared Christianity to be the official religion of the Roman Empire. So Constantine is the first Christian emperor. Theodosius is the one who adopts Christianity as the official religion for the Roman Empire. Okay, I am going to stop there. We'll talk about the fall of the Roman Empire next time. So, depending on what day you are, A or B, next week, Tuesday and Wednesday, depending on whether you're A day or B day, we will have the test on Greece and Rome. So I would strongly advise over the weekend looking over your notes and getting ready for that test. This has been the longest unit so far. So this test will have some more questions on it. So you need to be ready for that so that you can do a good job. And we're already just about halfway through the quarter. So it's really essential to do well on this. And then the next unit test we have, and then we will have the semester exam in January, middle of January. Okay, have a good weekend if I don't see you Friday. And like I said, when we get back, we're looking at Tuesday and Wednesday for the tests.